Barry has spent 2 decades at Equip for Equality, advocating for the rights of people with disabilities. And we are so grateful to have Barry with us today, presenting on the best practices for inclusion of people with disabilities. So with that, please welcome Barry Taylor. Let me grab this little notice.
Are you going to pull up the PowerPoint?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There we go.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm thrilled to be able to share with you some of our thoughts about making your actions and your efforts in the legal profession accessible to people with disabilities. And we've got a mixed audience with people who are law students who hopefully will be in law firms and public interest organizations in the future, and then those of you who already are. But I think it applies to everyone. So for those of you who aren't familiar with my organization, Equip for Equality, our mission is to provide advance the human and civil rights for people with disabilities in the state of Illinois. We're a statewide organization, and we provide free legal assistance for people with disabilities on issues that are related to their disability. So we wouldn't do a random divorce for somebody who has a disability because that issue isn't related to their disability, but instead we would handle things like employment discrimination when somebody's let go from the job as a result of having a disability. We also administer something called the Illinois ADA Project, and you see in the slide there's a link to that project, and that's our way to help people outside of people with disabilities. It's funding to serve anybody who has coverage under the ADA, and employers, businesses, government agencies, legal service organizations, and so we can provide free technical assistance and training under that grant. And our group is divided up into 3 different legal teams. The civil rights team that I oversee, we also have a special education clinic, and then an abuse investigation unit. And then at the bottom of this slide, you'll see our phone number and our email address, website address. All right. So as was said before, we're going to be talking about a variety of things, disability language, disability etiquette. We're going to talk about how you can accommodate different types of meetings, in person, virtual, and hybrid. Obviously, we're doing a little bit of everything these days, so knowing the nuances there is important. We're also going to talk about how to handle alternate formats requests for people who are blind and with low vision. As was said before, we'll talk about digital and website accessibility, accommodations for people with mental illness, and then some tips for how to make your workplace inclusive. So those of you who are already in the workplace, these are some tips that you can have, and those of you who will be moving into these different organizations and firms, you can bring that knowledge with you as you enter that space. We'll give some resources at the end, and then we'll also leave some time for questions. All right, so why are we talking about disability? Well, disability is the largest minority group out there. Estimates say 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people have some type of disability. When we're talking about disability, it can be physical disability, it can be a mental illness, a developmental disability, a sensory disability like deaf and hard of hearing, chemical sensitivity is a disability. A wide range of things are considered disability as long as you can show that there is a substantial limitation in a major life activity. And of course, some people are born with disabilities, other people acquire their disabilities. It's really the only protected class that anybody could join. And so it also, of course, goes across all our population, all races and socioeconomic statuses. So disability either does currently or will impact all of us, either personally or probably somebody that we know. What's interesting is that oftentimes disability isn't treated as other protected classes. Sometimes, it's treated more as a medical issue rather than a civil rights issue. When the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the 60s, disability wasn't part of that conversation. I think partly that was because of that perception of disability not being really a civil right and people taking a more medical model approach or more sort of paternalistic view of taking care of people with disabilities. And while that may be well-intentioned, it sort of disregards the civil rights that people with disabilities have. All right, so now we're going to talk about some language tips and some disclaimers and some limitations. And when I get to a point where I'm talking about disability language, sometimes, unfortunately, people are like, okay, here comes the political correctness talk, and I'm going to tune out for a while. And I really hope you don't do that, because this is really important. Because when we're talking about use of proper language, what we're talking about is it shows respect. It's respect for somebody's identity. And just like we should have respect for other types of identities, disability is no different. So if you could enter that mindset with me for a few minutes, I hope that you'll engage and hopefully can internalize some of the things that we're going to talk about. Of course, language is always evolving. What we discussed today may not be the case in the future. Certain terms we've used in the past are disfavored today. Just like with other identities, language evolves, and we have to be willing to evolve with that. And what I always say is that, if you're not sure, one of the best things to do is to ask people their preference. So even if maybe a certain terminology is accepted generally, there may be terms that work and don't work for certain people. And so if you're not sure, you're talking to a client, just like you would want to understand and respect other parts of their identity, disability should be just the same sort of thing. As I said, the best course of action oftentimes is asking people what they prefer. And one of the terms that you'll hear in the disability community is this concept of nothing about us without us. A lot of disability policy is made without including people with disabilities, not letting them be part of the conversation, not giving them a seat at the table. And so one of the things when you're working on disability issues, like you're acquiring software and you want to make sure it's accessible, have people with disabilities work with you to determine whether it is accessible. If you're establishing a policy, don't do that in a vacuum. Involve people with disabilities in that conversation so that it really is reflective of what people really want as opposed to what you think they might want. All right, so here's some specific language tips. As I've referenced before, some terms become outdated, and oftentimes the reason terms are outdated is because they came from really a sort of a marginalized history through eugenics or institutionalization. So terms like handicapped and insane actually have really negative consequences historically. And so to use those today really harkens back to some negative aspects of people's history. And so we want to avoid those. And really today, the common term that everybody is using is the word disability, person with a disability, disabled person. That's really all you need to know. Obviously, that could change in the future, but right now that's what it is. The main law we're talking about is the Americans with Disabilities Act, so it's baked in. That's the term that people use. Another thing that we oftentimes see is that sometimes common phrases paint disability as negative or victimize the person. You see this on the news all the time where they'll say somebody is an AIDS victim, or that's a man who is suffering from multiple sclerosis, or the woman was afflicted with schizophrenia. Those all have judgmental terms in it, right? Victim, suffering, afflicted. You talk to a lot of people with disabilities, they're like, I don't feel like I'm afflicted. I don't feel like I'm suffering. That's just who I am. That's part of my identity. And so we just want to be neutral. You're a person living with AIDS. You're a man who has multiple sclerosis. You're a woman with schizophrenia. It's factual, but it doesn't add that judgment to it, that victimization or negative component to it that sort of influence the whole perception of disability. Disability is a natural condition that occurs in life, and it's not something that we need to, show pity for or victimize people and add those judgments. We just need to let it be what it is. Some more language tips. You see hopefully you can see the graphic here on this slide. You see a woman and she's sort of wrapped up into, it looks like police tape, and it says, stop presenting me as wheelchair bound and confined to a wheelchair. This is another term that we hear all the time. He's wheelchair bound. He's confined to a wheelchair. Well, that's not true, right? I mean, in fact, if you talk to folks who use wheelchairs, they say, thank God for my wheelchair. It lets me get to where I want to be. I'm not confined to a wheelchair. The wheelchair is actually freeing. It gets me out of the house. It gets me on to the meetings I need to go to wherever the person is looking to go. And so we want to avoid those kind of terms, wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. And again, just be factual. He's a wheelchair user. He's a person who uses a wheelchair. Plain and simple. You don't sort of add that sort of negative connotation because the assistive technology is actually a positive thing in people's lives. We also want to avoid the disability euphemisms, and again, these come from well-intentioned places where people are trying to sort of do things that make it sound better than, just using some sort of different kind of language like differently abled or handy capable. Special needs is a really common one. Physically challenged. Again, most folks with disabilities will tell you that's not what they want to here. They just want to say disability. That's sort of the plain fact of it. Of course, there are some people who say they might prefer that, but my experience in over a couple decades of doing this work is that that's really not what folks are looking for when they're looking at their identity. Sorry, I didn't click in that last little set, so you'll see all the different euphemisms that I just mentioned. All right, so now we're going to talk about a concept called people first versus identity first. All right, so people first language is this whole concept, and this is sort of the traditional rule that emphasizes the person and shows that the person is not defined by their disability. And so what you're doing is, instead of identifying the person's disability and then going from there, you talk about they're a person with multiple sclerosis, a person with epilepsy, instead of saying that's an epileptic, that's a diabetic, because then it becomes all about that disability is really all they are. And of course, all of us have multiple components to our identities, right? And for people with disabilities, disability is part of it, but there are other parts of their identity too. They may be a basketball player, they may be African-American, they may be a lawyer, you know, and those are, and if you just put that identity first, that sort of negates the rest of their personhood is where that comes from. So the example, woman with epilepsy versus epileptic or epileptic woman would be an example of people first. But just when you thought that was the way to go with everything, there's a little bit of complication. In more recent years, there's this new concept called identity first language. And there's certain types of disabilities where people don't really like people first language. And this comes up mostly in the deaf community, which sees, oftentimes people in deafness see that as really an identity outside of disability. They see it as a cultural issue. And so they like being called deaf first, as opposed to a person who's deaf. We also see this arising in the autism community, where people say that I'm an autistic person, as opposed to a person living with autism. And I don't know if you can see this graphic, but you've got a woman there saying, I am autistic. I don't have autism. I'm not a person with autism. I don't live with autism. And you see her on the couch, you know, next to an A. And that's just sort of a, you know, humorous way to talk about it. But it just shows that there's certain evolving concepts and certain identities, particularly deafness and autism, where people are really identifying with this identity first. So that's confusing, right? But you just want to sort of try to keep up with these types of terms. But when I am confronted with the situation and talking to an individual, I just ask them and say, you know, what would you prefer I use? Do you want people first language, or would you prefer identity first language? People tell me, and then we go from there. So that's always the thing to do. And sometimes when you're writing about it, sometimes people say you can alternate it and modify it that way. You know, there's a lot of different ways to do it. But again, I think talking to the person first is always a good rule of thumb. All right, so now we're going to get into what I call etiquette. But it's basically just how you interact with people with disabilities. So one thing to remember is to speak directly to the person rather than maybe a companion or an interpreter. This happens all the time, and it sort of infantilizes people with disabilities a lot of times. So you've got a graphic here. In case you can't see it, I'll read it out. You've got a woman who's talking to another woman. They're both standing, and then there's another person in a wheelchair. And so the woman is talking to the other woman. She says, so will Paul be going to college? And Paul, the guy in the wheelchair, says, I believe I'm Paul and I'm right here. And so this happens all the time for folks in wheelchairs or folks with other types of disabilities, where people will not talk to them directly, and they'll talk to the other person who's there, whether it's a parent or a spouse or a caregiver, whoever it might be. And you know, that's not the person that you're talking to. You talk directly to the person. And if there is an issue why the person can't respond directly because of maybe a language issue or a cognitive issue, you can work with that. But you always want to start with talking to the person with disability first in any kind of situation. And that's the same thing when you're talking to deaf people. It's very easy to sort of look to the interpreter and talk directly to the interpreter, but you really have to fight that impulse and look directly at the person with the disability.
Hi, John. I just wanted to chat with you about this roof.
I think somebody needs to mute yourself. We're hearing your conversation. So I was talking about the interpreter, it's really easy to just look to the interpreter instead of the deaf person directly. Like if I were in a deposition and I was deposing a deaf person, I would look directly to the deaf person so they can read my lips, and then they might look away and look at the interpreter to see what's being said, but I would keep my focus on the deaf person. Again, that shows respect, and that's the person you're having the conversation with. So you wouldn't turn to the interpreter and say, ask them this. You know, you just directly talk to the person, and then they look to the interpreter as they need to. You also want to make sure that when you're, I see a lot of well-intentioned people wanting to quote unquote help people with disabilities, but to the point of taking away their personal autonomy. So for instance, we have a person in my office who's blind, and he would often, pre-pandemic, would take the train down, and our office is on the other side of the loop from the train, and he would walk across the loop, either using his cane or using a service animal, and was able to do so quite successfully. But people would see him and think, oh my gosh, that person's blind. I need to go help him cross the street or do something like that. And he would say people would like grab him and help him across the street. And just think about if you were blind and you had you weren't able to see the person approaching you, all of a sudden you feel somebody touching you and, quote unquote, helping you, how disconcerting that would be. And again, it's coming from a good place, but if you just use the rule of thumb of perhaps in certain circumstances, some blind people may be doing something that could use some help, or you perceive that they might need some help. So the best thing to do is if you go up and you say, it looks like you might have some difficulty walking across the street. Can I help you? Or is there anything I can do to help? And, the person will say, oh yeah, I really am a little bit, lost here. Can you help direct me this way? Or they may say, I'm fine. Thanks for the offer. And then you're done. But don't just grab the person and assume that you're going to save them from something when they might not need saving. Of course, we want to remember that all disabilities are not visible. There are a lot of invisible disabilities, mental illness, HIV, epilepsy, diabetes. And so when we're talking about disability, it's much broader than the visible disabilities that we sometimes think of reflexively. I also really want to avoid the patronizing attitudes and actions that come sometimes with disability. Sometimes it's called disability porn, which is basically sensationalizing people with disabilities, saying, wow, look at that person with disability doing this basically ordinary thing, but they're doing it, it's sensationalized because they have a disability. And sometimes when that sensationalization happens, it's sort of like, boy, by the grace of God, I don't have to go through what they're going through, and they're able to overcome all these things that I don't have to do. And it sort of times engenders some pity or sometimes some sensationalizing when it really, neither of those are warranted. And there's a great video, I've got a link here on the slide, this great activist from New Zealand, Stella Young, and she talks about this disability porn, and her TED Talk is called "I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much." And it's really, I think, gives some direct insight into this, hearing directly from a person with disability how it feels to have to go through this sort of sensationalizing or disability porn as she talks about it. Moving on to, oops, I didn't give you the link there. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. There we go. So a few more tips. So when you meet somebody who's blind, sounds, common sense, but a lot of times people will forget to identify themselves and others. And for blind people, it's really important to associate a voice with a name. And so saying your name and then they can take it from there is really helpful. And just knowing who's in the room is really helpful for them as well. If you have somebody who's using a service animal or a wheelchair or other assistive technology, that's really part of their person, right? And a part of them. And you don't want to be leaning on the wheelchair or playing with a service animal or, doing anything with their technology that's really something that they're using. So being respectful of their space and whatever assistive technology or other devices or service animal they're using is really important as well. It's really tempting. Some of these service animals are really cute and you want to play with them like a pet, but they're working and you want to be careful not to invade that space. If you're meeting with somebody with a wheelchair, just think about if you're in a wheelchair and you're lower and you're like at a big reception, like the Pili Pro Bono reception. If somebody was in a wheelchair, they'd be craning their neck up the whole time and how difficult that is. You don't have to make a big deal of it, but if you're talking to somebody in a wheelchair, just grab a chair and sit down and then talk to them. And so you're talking directly at the same airspace as they are, and that'll make it more relaxed and engender a more comfortable conversation. And as I said before, when you're talking to somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing, face them when they speak so they can lip read. You want to be careful not to be like eating when you're talking to them or putting your hands on your face. You also don't need to shout. For deaf folks, some have no hearing at all. And so shouting isn't going to make a difference, and others may be hard of hearing and they're using oftentimes maybe a cochlear implant or a hearing aid, and they'll adjust as they need to. If they need you to speak up, they'll let you know, but you don't need to do that otherwise. All right. We're next going to talk about some concepts that I think can get a little bit mushy sometimes. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. And they're the concepts of equality, accommodation, and accessibility. So we've got three graphics here. And the first graphic is you see three people in front of, it looks like maybe a bulletin board or a blackboard. And there's three people there. The person in the middle seems to be taller and able to sort of access the board easier. The person to, it appears her left is shorter in stature and can't reach as much. And then the person on the right, it looks to be like maybe in a scooter and can't access that at all, right? Well, that's listed as equality because everybody's getting access to the same thing, right? There's no difference. Everybody's treating it the same, but the experience is very different. Accommodation, what you're doing is something reactive. You're like, oh, wow, this board isn't accessible to everybody. What can we do? And as you'll see, the person in the middle doesn't need an accommodation. The person on the left, it looks like they have maybe a little bit of a soapbox or a little stool there. They're able to now reach that blackboard more easily. And then the person in the scooter, looks like they put in some kind of ramp and platform so they can reach as well as anybody else. So that's accommodation in that you are reacting to an inaccessible situation. And then you have accessibility, and that, or you can also call it universal design. Some people will say those are the two concepts that are often used. And what that means is you think about accessibility beforehand. And so it's proactive, making sure that you're thinking about disability in anything you're doing. And as you see, what's happened here is the board is bigger and it's lower, and all three of them are able to access it, and there's no need for an accommodation there. So equality, you're giving everybody the same thing. Accommodation, you're being reactive. Sometimes that's called equity, where you're giving people what they need. And then you have accessibility, where you're doing proactively, ensuring through universal design that it's accessible. And so accessibility is the goal, and really accommodations are just some of the tools used to get there. All right, let's move to some practical things about accommodations, and we'll first start with in-person meetings. And there are a variety of things. Some of these are obvious, some of the things maybe you haven't thought of, but things like an American Sign Language interpreter, real-time captioning, it's also known as CART. Those of you who go to court, this is sort of like your court reporter. They're taking down word for word in English. American Sign Language is actually a different language. So some people are fluent in American Sign Language, but not fluent in English. So CART wouldn't work for some people who are deaf. And for people who are fluent in English and they're deaf, maybe CART would be better for them. Sometimes people who are deaf and know English don't learn American Sign Language, especially those who become deaf later in life. Another types of things that can come up is supported service providers, which is basically if somebody comes in and they need assistance, maybe a sighted guide, or maybe assisting them with any kind of personal activities they need, like going to the restroom, putting documents in alternate formats. We'll talk about that in a second. Having somebody available to do note-taking for somebody who can't take notes for themselves because of their disability. Maybe giving an extended break for a variety of reasons, including maybe a mental illness where people are having a hard time concentrating. Alternate seating or seating arrangements. So you'll see this in movie theaters where they'll leave space for wheelchair users to have, so they have access throughout the auditorium. You can do the same thing in your meetings, leaving spaces for folks so that folks with disabilities are integrated into the rest of the seating area. And another thing we see with people with chemical sensitivity is a scent-free policy saying, please don't wear scents to this meeting, knowing that there are some people who would have adverse reactions to scents. All right, let's move to where we've been going the last few years, and that's tips on making virtual meetings more accessible. So one of the things that you can do that's really helpful is thinking about accommodations ahead of time. So if you're doing a meeting, just put in your meeting notice, do you need an accommodation to access this meeting? If so, here's what you need to do. So for instance, if somebody needs captioning in a Zoom meeting, or somebody needs a sign language interpreter, if you put that ahead of time and people see that in your meeting notice, they'll have a way to do that, and you won't be sort of in that horrible situation on the day of, you know, this isn't working for me, this isn't accessible. People didn't have a way to do that. So thinking ahead of time on how that can happen. You also want to make sure that your meeting leader is educated on accommodations or has somebody there who does know how to use it, because there's nothing worse than hiring an interpreter or a captioner and then not really knowing how to tell people how to access those accommodations. It just sort of kills the whole intent of making accommodations. We always like to check in at the beginning of the meeting. If we do have an interpreter or a sign language or a captioner, just check in. Can everybody see the interpreter? Sometimes on Zoom, you have to sort of do things like pinning or spotlighting in order for people to see the interpreter. So checking in and making sure and not really starting your meeting until everybody has the equal access. An agenda ahead of time is helpful for people so they can plan and understand sort of what's coming up instead of having to react on the fly. Of course, that document should be in accessible format, which we'll talk about. Great. Moving on to the next slide. Another thing to do, especially for people who are blind, is what's called speaker identification. I mentioned this before. So if I'm talking, just say, this is Barry, and that way people can know who's speaking and really follow the conversation a little bit more easily. Document sharing, making sure any documents you send, if you can, send them in advance so people can go through them rather than having to react to them. One of the reasons this is important is there's this thing called screen readers. And screen readers for blind people are allowing them to, using this different kinds of technology, to actually have the technology voice what the text is, and they can understand that. But when you're projecting, say, like my PowerPoint today, they wouldn't be able to use their screen reader for that. And so by sending it ahead of time, they can review the materials and be familiar with it and not have to sort of figuring it out on the fly. And of course, you want to make sure that's accessible as well. Communication style, a lot of times people will use graphics in presentations. So for instance, when I've been talking about some different graphics I've used, I've tried to be careful to explain what that is rather than assuming that people who will just look at it themselves and figure it out. Well, if you're blind, you can't do that. And so just taking some time to explain things like if you're using a graph, rather than just saying, we'll see how the graph does this, you actually explain this graph does this, and you give a little bit more context for people. And of course, that's helpful for everybody, right? Because you're giving more information, people learn in different ways. But certainly for people with disabilities, that's really helpful. And then monitoring the sound. It's really terrible when you're a blind person and you're really trying to key in on the sound and people come in and there's alternate noise. Obviously, it's not great for everybody, but you can set ahead on Zoom on muting people ahead of time so they come in and you avoid that background noise and distractions. Some additional tips, videos. You see, if you're deaf, you're not going to really know what's going on in the video unless it's captioned. So making sure your videos are captioned, there's ways to do that. It's really easy these days. Websites, we'll talk about that a little bit, but if you're using a website during a virtual meeting, let people know ahead of time and they can maybe open it on an alternate browser and then they can access it because again, they're not going to be able to really follow the website if they're blind, if you're just showing it. And then the share screen sparingly. Again, if you're maybe have somebody who's reading lips and you're using a PowerPoint the whole time and sharing screen, you can't really see the person as well. And then again, the screen reader doesn't work when you're sharing a screen. So both of those are problematic for folks. A few more virtual tips. Using a neutral background is really helpful. Backgrounds can be distracting for people who have focus issues, and then also people with low vision, it can be a problem. This is one that you may not know of, but limiting the use of the chat. So if you use a screen reader, you're going to hear all the things that people type in the chat. And so you're going to hear what the person's saying, but all those chat is also going to be doing. And so every time somebody comes in and says, hello, how you doing? They'll hear that. So if you can limit the use of the chat to the things that are really relevant, that can make a big difference. And then the final thing that we've talked about before is really engaging people with disabilities, either internally by employees you have or externally when you're evaluating things like your meeting platform. So Zoom is very accessible. There are a lot of other meeting platforms that aren't. And we've learned that. You've seen, for instance, the state of Illinois' WebEx. Initially, when the pandemic started, we were getting all kinds of calls from blind and deaf people saying, this WebEx is the worst. We can't access these meetings. And some of these were state employees. Some of them were people going to different meetings, accessing certain benefits. And so we've been working with the state. They've been really collaborative on this to work with that platform to make it more accessible and address some of the problems that people are getting. But again, thinking ahead of time about disability before you purchase something like that can make a real difference. And involving people with disabilities in that process is always a great idea. All right, for hybrid meetings, some of these are things are probably obvious. Things like the placement of microphones, making sure that people are able to hear not only a presenter, but maybe some people in the audience who are asking questions. Audio description. So again, if you have people who are blind, if you describe things in the room, rather than people just assuming people can figure it out visually. Lighting, making sure that there's good lighting of people, so there's not shadows, or you don't want to put people like in front of a window and then it makes their face unable to be seen, so you can't lip read or follow what's going along. And then just being really clear on the timing so that people can plan accordingly. So if they need to go to the restroom and they need assistance, they can build that in. All right, we're now shift to alternate format. So this is accommodating people who are blind or low vision. We've talked a little bit about this, but we want to dig in a little deeper. So we want to make sure that when people are sent electronic versions of documents, that they're not scanned, like scanned PDFs, because screen readers can't read those at all. But there's ways to make PDFs accessible, and just a Google search will really help you get there. Also, a lot of times people with low vision use large print, and large print really can make a difference for folks to access the information themselves. So typically, when large print, we're talking at least 20 point, and some people want it bigger than that, the font size. Also, typically you want to put it in bold and use some sort of font that's sans serif. So Arial, Tahoma, or Helvetica are three of the ones that a lot of folks with low vision seem to want. But again, as we've said before, one of the things you want to do is ask the person what they prefer. For instance, I have a person who has low vision, and sometimes people say, oh, they have low vision, I need to make it large print. Well, she tells me when I email her, she can make it big on her end. So just send it regular font, and then she'll take it from there. Other people want it to be larger when you send it. So everybody's a little different. Everybody has different amount of technical skills and how they want to receive information. So again, that's always the best policy. For a long time, people just assumed that all blind people read Braille, and people were spending a lot of money converting documents into Braille. And a lot of this was before we had emails and the internet and things like that, and we were doing a lot more paper documents. But again, now that we have the advent of being able to send things electronically, we see Braille is not as commonly asked. And then there are a lot of blind people, especially people who are blind in later in life, who don't even read Braille. And so assuming that is just not something you want to do. And again, it can be costly. So you want to make sure the person wants the Braille before you go through that process. Other things you can do for those folks is provide qualified readers and note takers if that's something that they need. And then making sure that you put your documents in plain text. So putting something in a TXT format or a doc file under Microsoft Word typically are the best and most accessible. All right, now we're going to talk about digital accessibility. And with digital accessibility, the Americans with Disabilities Act is actually silent on whether the ADA covers websites and the internet, because the ADA was passed in 1990 and websites and the internet really weren't part of our culture. And then that happened later in the 90s. And so there's no thing in the ADA, if you look it up, saying that that's part of the ADA. But the Department of Justice, which enforces and interprets the ADA, has made clear that the websites and the internet is covered by the ADA. And so it's really important. So law firms and public interest organizations, you have a legal obligation to make sure that the information you are putting out there is accessible. And there are a lot of common barriers that are out there. One of the biggest one is conveying content visually through a graphic, image, or chart without labeling it with alternate text. So what you can do is you can insert text behind an image, and so when a screen reader goes over it, it actually reads what that alternate text is and describes the image. So I'm going to show you how to do this just a second here. So if you look on the right side of this graphic, you see ALT and red box for alt text. And all you have to do is you would right click on this. Okay, we practiced this ahead of time. No, it's not doing it. Okay. All right. There it goes. Thanks. So if you look at this menu, if you go all the way down, it says View Alt Text. And if I click on that, then you'll see in the box what I wrote. Image of a finger pressing a red button with the letters ALT in white on a yellow background. Okay, that's basically describing what that picture is. So if somebody goes over that, they would just hear that thing. And you'll see here it says you can generate the text for them. I found that the generated text is pretty good, but not always great. So you can use that, but you always want to edit it in case it doesn't really accurately describe that. But if you build that into every image you have, that'll make sure it's accessible to people who are using screen readers. All right, so let's go back to the slide there. Okay, and we've got a link here to a Microsoft article that explains how to do alt text. So if you want to do that in the future, that could be really helpful. We also see a lot of presentations that use color to convey meaning. So like the questions in red are required. Well, if you're a screen reader, you're not going to know which question is red. Or if you're colorblind, you're not going to know that either. So using color can be really problematic as well. And then requiring the use of mouse without keyboard alternatives is also a problem for folks who are blind, or people who have dexterity issues and can't use a mouse. Some other issues on digital accessibility, displaying content that can't be adjusted by font size and color contrast. Most websites, they'll have a little part where you can modify it, but you have to build that in oftentimes. How you organize the content, if you organize a certain way, it rereads like your whole header every time, and you have to go through all that. You can organize in a way where it goes directly to the content and avoids that kind of issue and makes it easier for people to navigate it independently. Also providing videos without captioning we talked about, and then also flashing visual content can trigger seizures, and obviously you don't want to do that. So avoiding that on your website is a good idea as well. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about accommodations for people with mental disabilities, and we've got asterisks here because these are good tips for anybody, but it is good for folks with mental illness in particular, as well as other disabilities. So modifying your times for meetings and allowing for a person to attend by phone or vice versa, depending on their mental illness. A lot of times people with mental illness may take certain medication. Maybe they're drowsy in the morning. So moving that deposition to the afternoon would make them a much better witness than if you have them in the morning. So knowing that's really important. Putting in information in writing. You can use literacy tools. There's ways to go in Microsoft Word and check, what the reading level is. So, can you get it down to a 6th grade level for people who have lower literacy? That's always a good thing to do. Allowing for frequent breaks. Using role playing when appropriate. So people who can't really conceptualize what things are going to be like, maybe going through the scenario of what it's going to be like at a deposition, or maybe actually going to the court and getting them a sense of that. And that maybe will relieve some anxiety they might have about the situation. Allowing support people or a support animal in meetings. And then agreeing on conduct and communication frequency and method. Sometimes, folks with mental illness and other people as well get, a little out of control, they get stressed, and having some sort of agreement on how that conduct and interaction is going to happen. Sometimes people get obsessive and they call like 10 times a day, and working out an agreement. Look, I will talk to you every Tuesday at 5 to give you an update what's going on in your case, and this is how we'll do it, or I'll send you an email. But reaching some sort of agreement will take away that confusion, that stress, and the difficulties that people sometimes have in that situation. All right, so we also wanted to focus on how to make your workplace as inclusive as possible. And again, some of you are already in the workplace and some of you are heading there, so hopefully these will be helpful. Often disability is overlooked in the conversation of disability. So if you're having, disability is overlooked in the conversation of diversity. So if you're having conversations about diversity in your workplace, making sure that disability is part of that. If you have diversity initiatives, like for instance, a lot of times people say, okay, we're going to celebrate Pride Month, or we're going to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. Think about maybe having a day for what you could commemorate disability. So July 26th is the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. October is Disability Employment Month. December 1st is World AIDS Day. Bringing disability as part of your overall DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, will really make a difference. Do you have any kind of employee resource groups? Does it include disability? Do you have goals about hiring certain percentages of different identities, including disability, and that kind of hiring initiative is a great idea as well. Second, making your hiring process as inclusive as possible. So again, you don't want to have a hiring notice that's inaccessible in a scanned PDF. You want to make sure your hiring notice has information about how to ask for accommodations. If you're putting something on your website, you want to make sure it's accessible to screen readers on your website, that kind of thing. Working intentionally to remove unintentional barriers. We see a lot of job descriptions that unintentionally exclude people with disabilities. They'll have like lifting requirements, and people with disabilities might not be able to lift a certain amount, and the job has nothing to do with lifting. It's just something that's been in there forever, and it's kept in there. There certainly are accommodations you can do for things that have to be lifted in the workplace that don't need to have. We also see a lot of driving requirements when actually The underlying essential function is traveling, and we can travel a lot of different ways besides driving, using ride share and public transportation. So think about, what is it that's important here? Is it actually driving, or is it traveling? So reviewing your job descriptions with an eye towards accessibility is really important. And then the last thing on this slide, centering disability, even if you don't have an employee who needs it. Again, being proactive. So thinking about having your space physically accessible instead of waiting until somebody with a disability comes in, you're like, oh man, I've got to retrofit this space. Think about it ahead of time so that if you hire somebody with a disability, it's accessible for them. And when they interview, they'll see, wow, they've really thought about this ahead of time. Similar with your digital accessibility. When you're acquiring technology, what can you do to make sure that it's accessible? Because you don't want to hire somebody who needs screen reader accessible technology, and then you have to retrofit that it's not accessible to them, and then there's a barrier there for them. And there's a link here, Disability Ends Procurement Toolkit, which is really helpful on how to procure technology that's accessible. Creating a culture where accommodations are standard and disability is valued. So considering policies like the scent-free policy, or automatically when you have a big event, hire an interpreter, even before it's asked for. That can show that you're thinking about disability proactively rather than reactively. Do you have somebody who's in management who has a disability? If they're comfortable sharing that and showing that that's a positive thing for leadership, and hopefully that reflects for the organization more broadly. Flexibility is the key. Being open to doing things differently. So somebody who has mental illness, maybe they have to go to therapy at 4 o'clock on Wednesdays. Well, okay, we'll let them go at 4, and then on Thursday, they'll come in an hour earlier. They're still doing the same number of hours, but you're modifying it so they can have access to what they need for them to be productive in the workplace and to address the needs of their disability. It's really about being flexible about where, when, and how things are done. We've learned that through the pandemic. People used to always say you had to be in person. That's an essential function. Now we're seeing that people can work from home, and that's really been a great boon for people with disabilities who may have issues regarding traveling that would have prevented them from being able to do the job before. When you're training your supervisors on reasonable accommodation, try to make that centralized so you don't have this sort of rogue supervisor who says, yeah, we're not going to do that, or does the knee-jerk reaction saying, we've never done it this way, we can't do it this way. Oftentimes also people being, well, they didn't use the magic words, they didn't use disability, they didn't use reasonable accommodation. You don't have to. And so training people so they really understand and centralizing it so your organization is consistent is really, really important. And then there is also a business case for disability. There's all kinds of studies that show that people with disabilities are more productive, have lower turnover, and actually can boost morale when they're in the workplace. And there's a link here on the report from Disability N on that. And then also think about your customer base, right? I mean, if you're accessible to your customers, you're also being accessible to your employees. So you're winning both for your employees as well as anybody who's accessing your services. You're a law firm and you have somebody with a disability coming in, you want them to feel like they're being welcomed and your place is accessible for them. And then never stop learning. We've got some links here for some really great resources. I used acronyms because of space, but JAN is the Job Accommodation Network. If you have any kind of accommodation request, this is a great place to go. You can actually click on different types of disabilities and what common accommodations could be there, and that will help you with the interactive process with the person trying to figure out what the best option is. The Great Lakes ADA Center provides a lot of training and technical assistance on disability. There's also an organization called EARN. I always have to look up what the acronym stands for. It's the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion. A ton of resources there. And then Disability N that I mentioned before has fantastic resources, including on procurement issues. All right, and then the last couple slides are some resources, and then we'll see if anybody has any questions. So if you're going to court, and I've got the resources here in Chicago, but this is across the state. So the Northern District, the federal court here in Illinois has an access coordinator, and you have a link there. So if you have a client who needs some sort of accommodation, or maybe you're an attorney who is deaf or blind and you need accommodation, you can do this as well. Just click on that link and they'll tell you what you need to do to make those requests. And then every county in the state of Illinois has what's called a court disability coordinator. I've got the link here for Cook County, but they're all across the state. If you go to each county's website, they should have a link to their disability coordinator, and that's the person who's been designated by that court to be the point person for accommodations for anybody who's accessing the court. It can be an attorney, it can be a litigant, it can be a family member. The ADA is very broad. It covers companions as well as litigants. So anybody who needs to be there and have access would be entitled to an accommodation, and using these court disability coordinators can make a real difference. All right, and as far as other resources, we have some guidelines, accessibility guidelines. So if you have a meeting, the National Disability Rights Network has some really great resources there. Communicating about people with disabilities, this is sort of the language issues. Also a link from the National Disability Rights Network, some information about disability culture that can be really helpful, and then a guide for making easy to read resources. So this is the whole literacy issue that I mentioned before. And I think that's all I was planning to talk about. I agreed to leave about 10 minutes for questions. So happy to answer any questions. I don't know if you're monitoring the chat.
Got one from the chat now.
Sure.
Is it best to designate one person in an office to coordinate accessibility and accommodations, or just basically like what has worked best in your experience and what can you recommend to folks?
Sure. I'm going to repeat the question. I'm not sure if everybody could hear that. So the question is, in an organization, is it best to designate one person to be the person who handles accommodation requests, or is it, can you decentralize it? I think both are helpful. I think it's good to have one person who's sort of the person who's centralizing in this, maybe has some extra training, whether that's an HR person or somebody who's listed. If you're a government agency, there's a requirement to have what's called an ADA coordinator. But for private entities, there's not that specific requirement by the law, but it's certainly a good practice. There's tons of training out there for that. But one of the reasons you want to have a centralized person is in order to ensure that you're being consistent across the organization, because that's where we often see, like a lot of times what the common scenario we'll have is a person with disability is working and they've gotten a great accommodation, and then all of a sudden the supervisor changes and the new supervisor says, we're not going to provide that kind of accommodation. And they sort of just go off on their own, as opposed to saying, well, this is something the organization agreed was important, was valuable, was something we should do, and was reasonable. And then everything kind of flips and the person ends up getting fired, or the accommodation goes away, that kind of thing. And that happens when things are too decentralized. So obviously you want to train your supervisors so that they're consistent, they can recognize disability, but I think you always want to have a centralized process, if possible, maybe a centralized type of form where people fill out so you're asking for the same kind of information. So again, I think a centralized person is great, but you don't want that person to be the only person who knows things, and that person should really take the lead on training your supervisors or giving them resources on getting those supervisors trained, because I'd say the number one thing that where employers go wrong is not responding appropriately to reasonable accommodation requests, either not recognizing that's what's going on, not understanding their obligation under the law, or just basically saying, we're not going to do that. The ADA talks about an interactive process and that it should be a conversation. And you don't have to provide the preferred accommodation. So somebody may say, I need this. And you think, well, we can't provide that, but we could provide this. And it's a little bit on negotiation. Obviously, you want to defer to the person with disability, what makes sense to them. But ultimately, the legal standard is an effective accommodation. But you're not going to get to that if you immediately say, we can't do this. This is outrageous. We're never going to provide that, because that's taking away that interactive process and getting to yes and figuring out what would work for you as the organization and for the person with the disability.
Got a couple more coming from the chat. I'll give you just this next one. Any tips about inclusion within like guardianship cases or amplifying voices of an individual with disabilities, just to make sure that they are being respected in those types of guardianship cases?
Yeah, so the question is about inclusion of people with disabilities who have guardians. Great question. So for those who aren't aware, if you're an adult with a disability and you're deemed by a court not able to make decisions for yourself, you can have a guardianship placed over you. Have somebody designated as the person who makes that decision. Sometimes it's a family member, sometimes it might be a private guardian, sometimes it's a public guardian. It can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. And sometimes people really are impaired in their decision making, and they need that type of assistance. So I'm not saying, guardians are never appropriate, but what we see in Illinois is the overuse of guardianship. We see a lot of people getting plenary guardians over there themselves. And so when I say plenary guardians, that means really over all their decisions. what we think is a better thing to do if somebody needs some assistance is to have what's called a limited guardianship. So maybe the person has a hard time understanding financial issues. So having assistance on financial issues, but they still get to make decisions about their personal relationships or about their health care. And then there's also a new law that was passed that's called supported decision-making, where you have built in some supports, some natural supports or some supports you acquire to help you make those decisions, but don't have that guardianship over you where you really aren't part of the conversation. What should be happening, even if you have a guardian, the guardian is supposed to effectuate the desires, the needs, the goals of the person with a disability. And oftentimes we see where the guardian is being paternalistic and saying, yeah, I think you need to be in an institution. You can't live in the community. You're too disabled for that. We had a case involving somebody whose guardian wanted to sterilize their ward. And we actually went to court and prevented that sterilization from happening and established some helpful precedent that said there are due process rights for people with disabilities, and guardians don't have that level of authority. And then we were able to take that appellate decision and codify it into a state law. So now Illinois has a law about sterilization, and that arose from a guardianship context. We also unfortunately see some guardians who do some financial exploitation because sometimes people with disabilities are getting money from maybe some sort of personal injury award or maybe their SSI checks or that kind of thing. So unfortunately, we get the calls from the problem situations. And so there's certainly a lot of guardianships that are working well, but there are a lot that we hear about where they're not. And we either try to prevent those guardianships from getting in place when they're inappropriate, or try to remove or modify or transfer guardianships when they're not appropriate for the person with a disability.
Got one more. Are you seeing AI tools like ChatGPT playing a role in either increasing or decreasing accessibility?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think this is something that could be a real benefit for people with disabilities because technology generally has been fantastic for people with disabilities. I mean, as I was saying before, we used to deal with all these print documents, and now people being able to get things by email and that sort of thing. I think that the tricky part is the technology accessible, and have they involved people with disabilities ahead of time to make sure it's accessible for screen readers and some of the other types of accessibility that we talked about for people with, if it's some sort of oral kind of thing, is there captioning, that kind of thing. So I think in general, it has the potential to be really, really positive, and most technology has been really positive and made such a difference. I mean, Apple iPhones, what they can do for accessibility is just amazing. And I just have, so many friends who are blind or who are deaf and have just feel like their world has opened up because of technology. And I'm hopeful that AI will be in that same realm, but it's not going to work if people don't think ahead of time and build accessibility and build people with disabilities, include them in the development and implementation of AI. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any.
All right, well, I've got my contact information on the last slide. I assume people are going to be able to get the slide deck. Is that right? Is it emailed to folks? Okay, so you've got my contact information, my phone number, my email address. Feel free to reach out to me. Until the end of September, I'm retiring at that point, and then at that point, you need to go through our general number, which was on the second slide. So depending on timing, use the appropriate number from there. Thanks very much for your attention. Appreciate it. Turn it back over to you.
No problem. Thank you so much, Barry, for your time. This was quite an informative presentation. I'm always left with the idea that disability is a protected class that it's possible to join later in life. And just as we look at aging and disability from COVID, it's very possible that we're dealing with a lot more of that in society. So it is great to be proactive rather than reactive as much as we can. So with that, we will close our session, and I will be sending around these slides for folks who want to access them. And as Barry said, he has his contact information available through his retirement date. And I figure at that point, he'll be on a beach somewhere and we won't be able to get those answers. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.